Good morning, afternoon, and evening, people of the interwebs. This is Boyce Brown, aka Stone Fruit, with yet another edition of the Hard Line, according to Stone Fruit, with a gentleman and a scholar, a Krishna devotee, a Nietzsche enthusiast, a kindred mutant genius, and my friend, Tod Desmond.
All right.
How are you doing, Mr. Desmond? Professor Desmond.
I'm doing well. I'm a mutant genius. What's not to like? I hear the beautiful birds in the background there.
Yeah, no extra charge, royalty free.
Yeah. All right.
That's what you get in Lower Noah. Beautiful bird. So, as usual, this is accompanied with, this time, a series of articles at stonefruit.substack.com. This is the second of two podcasts that we are doing, corresponding to a 5-part series at Substack on a brief history of the Western idea of progress. And in our earlier podcast, we talked about that idea with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and then some early Catholic theologians like Joachim of Fiore and St. Augustine. And now we're going to bring it up to modern times, starting with the Renaissance and Renaissance humanism. And I didn't plan this, but all of my pictures for the stonefruit.substack.com wound up being pictures of humans, actually, of course, white male humans. And the Renaissance humanism article has a picture of Galileo. It's a quote from Albert Camus. I think our favorite philosopher is Nietzsche. My second favorite has got to be Albert Camus. Who's your second favorite philosopher?
Well, my first favorite, at least a Western philosopher, and probably philosopher, because the Vedanta philosophers were more theologians, but Plato's my first favorite, and then Nietzsche. I look at Plato and Nietzsche like the bookends of Western philosophy, the first and the last.
Yes, and I didn't mention in the introduction that among all of those other accolades I bestowed upon you, you are a veteran philosophy professor.
Yeah, I got 10 years now there at the College of Southern Maryland.
So you know whereof you speak, Mr. Desmond.
Yeah.
Plato. So you put Plato first and Nietzsche second. Okay, I go Nietzsche and then Camus. And I love Camus because he's so accessible.
Oh yeah, I like him too.
And he's very literary and he's very witty. And of Galileo, he said, this is a paraphrase, because Galileo renounced his heliocentric theory of the universe because he didn't want to get killed or jailed.
Right. He did get jailed. He didn't want to get killed.
He didn't want to get killed. So Camus said something to the effect of, while we might admire his practicality, we might question his virility.
Sure, Camus. If you're in front of the papal inquisitor with all of his instruments of torture, I'd bet your virility would shrivel up like a cold dip in the icy stream.
You remember the Inquisition bit from Monty Python?
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
We're going to subject you to, it's an old lady, the comfy chair.
Yeah.
Ooh, touching her hands on the armrest. Ooh, this is very comfy indeed. So let's get into it. While many contemporary commentators on the Western idea of progress suggest that it might have originated in the late Renaissance or early Enlightenment, I follow Robert Nisbet's lead in placing the idea as far back as ancient Greece. I also agree that the modern idea of progress is a secularized version of a linear conception of time and the idea that history has a meaning oriented towards the future. Present in the teleology of divine providence in early Catholicism, the appearance of Jesus and his crucifixion put God's plan into action in history. The teleology ends with his reappearance and the creation of God's kingdom on earth. Modern thinkers promoted other teleologies that were similarly millennial. The Enlightenment was still a confident era. The task of man seemed to be to use reason and science to displace superstition, custom, and tradition, to inevitably yield progress towards the perfectibility of man. To begin sketching this formation, we must turn to the rise of humanism, a story that begins with the Byzantine Empire, which never called itself by that name. They saw themselves as the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which remained intact after the western half fell to marauding Germanic tribes. The Orthodox Church sees Catholicism as a heretical breakaway. When the Ottomans overthrew the eastern remainder of the Roman Empire around 1299 AD, a large number of intellectuals conversant in ancient Greek thought migrated throughout Western Europe, which had lost much of its ancient Greek and Roman heritage during the Dark Ages. This resurgence of formal learning in the early universities of Italy led to the formation of numerous other European universities throughout the continent, to secular humanism and the Renaissance. With the advent of the scientific revolution, beginning with Francis Bacon, we begin seeing an increasingly self-conscious modernity that abandons vague metaphysics and a reflexive obeisance to Greek and Roman sources, preferring experience and a universal method based on observation, induction, and experimentation to conquer, control, and exploit nature for what Bacon called the relief of man's estate. He was the first to use the word progress in a temporal rather than a spatial sense. His role was to remove the stumbling blocks on the path to inquiry. It is Bacon in whom we find the inextricable intertwining of progress with the exploitation of nature. We need to understand the genealogy of progress in Western intellectual history because there is not enough nature left to exploit, Tod Desmond. To provide.
You're mentioning there Bacon and the inductive method of reasoning. I think it's important to realize the difference between induction and deduction.
Lay it on us.
And induction is basically empiricism. You make observations of the material world and then you create theories, which is different from Plato's theory of these absolute forms of knowledge imprinted on everybody's soul. That for Plato, knowledge is remembering. At least that's how he has Socrates define knowledge in the dialogues, that every soul is eternal and is furthermore imprinted with these absolute eternal ideas or forms of reason, and that the goal of philosophy is to turn the eye of your soul away from the outer world into the idea of the good, which is the source of all the other absolute ideas, which are the source of the entire material cosmos. But the scientific revolution says, no, let's look out at the material world and empirically observe what's happening and then create experiments that we can test whether our theories about the material world are correct. They still use the mathematical method that Plato was the one who really introduced. I was just trying to, I know it was Tarnas, and he talked just about how this scientific revolution that began with the Age of Enlightenment took Plato's method, but turned his philosophical, the implications of it upside down. So instead of using a mathematical study of the empirically observable world, Plato was more interested in the mathematical descriptions of the movements of the planets. Instead of doing that, in order to learn about the soul, they use those mathematical forms just to learn how to manipulate nature to what was the relief for the relief of man's estate. Yeah. So for bodily comfort, for a more comfortable material situation, we use the divine light of reason to analyze the material world and figure out the mathematical laws that describe its behavior. But those mathematical laws were no longer linked back to these absolute ideas imprinted on an eternal soul. It was a big philosophical leap away from God, because Augustine and Aquinas equated Plato's idea of the good with God. And the other ideas encased within the idea of the good are the ideas in God's creative mind. So that started to fall away once you had Bacon come on the scene. And even Descartes, as you're going to go on and talk about, he was definitely a theologian, but he kind of put people's attention back on the material world.
Yeah, the material world and its devastation by quote unquote progress is what led me to write this whole series. There was a study probably maybe a decade ago by now that if the rest of the world were to have American standards of living, we would need another 7 or 8 planet Earths.
Yeah.
So there is no more progress left to obtain, essentially. And that is the underlying thesis of the whole series, but certainly the stirring crescendo that we'll get to at the end of this article at stonefruit.substack.com. But the first global ecological summit with all the heads of state of great note was the 1993 one in Rio. And George H.W. Bush, 1,000 points of light. He said that the American standard of living was non-negotiable at that summit.
Right.
And that is what has brought us to this perilous present. So it was left to Bacon's peers, especially Descartes, to elaborate on his notion of the scientific method. And I like Descartes. He said he was modest in his infinitely influential discourse on method, 1637. He said, "I have often wished that I were equal to some others in promptitude of thought, or in clearness and distinctness of imagination, or in fullness and readiness of memory. And besides these, I know of no other qualities that contribute to the perfection of mind. For as to the reason or sense, inasmuch as it is that alone which constitutes us men and distinguishes us from brutes, I am disposed to believe that it is found complete in each individual. We all have a sovereign cognitive ability."
Yeah, they call Descartes a rationalist as opposed to an empiricist, like David Hume was the archetypal empiricist. Knowledge comes from your 5 sense organs. Rene Descartes thought we are rational souls, like Plato said. But the one thing that I think contributed to the environmental crisis, certainly he's been accused of this, is his idea. He mentions what distinguishes us from what does he call the animals, the brutes, is reason. So for Plato, he believed in reincarnation. So even the animals and the plants and insects have eternal souls imprinted with all of the same absolute ideas that a soul inside a human body has. but they don't have reason because the bodies that those souls are inhabiting aren't equipped for rational thought. Rene Descartes said reason is the symptom of the soul. So the animals have no soul because they have no reason. And therefore they're just machines. And it appears as if they're sentient, but they're not. They're just complex machines. And he would refer to the automaton of his day. They had intricate clocks and little figures would come out and ring a bell like little robots. And he said, animals are just robots made by God. That's why they appear so almost lifelike. That's what Descartes thought, that they weren't even really alive. They're just material. But humans have a rational soul. And he furthermore said, there's two types of being: rational souls, which are not extended in space, but they think, and then matter, which is extended in space, but doesn't think. So the animals are extended in space, but they don't think, and therefore they have no soul. Our material bodies are extended in space, but our soul thinks. Therefore, it has no spatial extension. It's just got a reason. And then what was Princess Elizabeth, I think was her name, some royal family in one of the European countries said, well, if the soul is rational and rational things have no extension in space, how does your soul affect your body? How does your decision to raise your arm lead to your arm going up? And how, when the fire touches your hand, does that convey pain to your soul? Where it seems to be there's this cleavage that can't be, there's no intermediary connecting point between matter and mind. That's called the Cartesian split. And a lot of environmentalists like Al Gore say that's the beginning of the modern hatred of and abuse of the natural world, because it's a soulless machine. And then Al Gore, for example, said something very similar to what you said. It's our hankering for spiritual fulfillment that we try to fill by pouring in all sorts of material enjoyments, but it doesn't work. It's our desire for enjoyment is a black hole. It's bottomless. So that if we don't find some kind of a spiritual fulfillment that's equally infinite, we'll never be satisfied, and we'll just devour the earth in some attempt to distract ourselves.
Which we are well along in doing.
Yeah.
A lot of people point to, especially Western humans' propensity to dominate nature for creature comforts from, I believe it's Genesis in the Bible, where it states that God gave man the animals and the seeds of the earth and the fruits and the land to use. Mm-hmm. And that allowance to exploit, dating that far back, is considered by many a foundational reason why Western man is so happy to be so exploitive of nature.
Yeah, although if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure also there's a vegetarian diet prescribed for the human species in Genesis.
Is there?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. And then after, I'm pretty sure that is the case. And then after the flood with Noah, then God gave some allowance for eating meat, but you couldn't eat it if there was any blood in it, which would rule out all meat. Then that's the origin of the kosher laws, where they drain the blood. It's like, oh, not allowed to eat meat with blood in it. Just hold on. Let's just squeeze that blood out of here. I mean, you cannot fully squeeze blood out of meat. So I read, some scholar wrote about that, this move from vegetarian diet to a meat-eating diet. So even if it says I know it does say in Genesis that, here, these are for your enjoyment, also don't eat them. You ever see Louis C.K. talk about that? Anyway, he went in from, he's like, what? You're eating them? He's like, I didn't create those for you to eat. They're to have sex with. Because you eat them, them. That's disgusting. So that was pretty gross and funny in a Louis C.K. way. While I'm on that theme of the vegetarian origins of Western mind, Plato's Republic, which is the first book on political philosophy that most people point to.
Right.
They're looking for justice in the individual soul. And then Socrates says, oh, that's too hard. The soul's too small. Let's expand the soul to a city-state like Athens, and it will create the perfectly, ideally just city-state. And then therefore we'll be able to see where justice is in the city, and we can extrapolate back to the smaller pattern of the soul on the assumption that the pattern of the individual and the collective is the same. And the first ideal state that they create is vegetarian. And they drink wine and they wear wreaths of ivy and they sing of the gods together as they feast with their children. And then Glaucon says, oh, that's a city fit for pigs. He's like, what do you mean? He's like, there's no embellishments. There's no meat. There's no, luxury. He's like, oh, you want a feverish city. I thought you wanted a just city. That's all right. We can develop a feverish city too. And then he just goes on, and then later he pretends as if what he originally started calling the feverish city was a continuation of the attempt for a just city. So he's playing all kinds of games in there. But when they add meat, he's like, well, now we're going to have to add an army. Why do we have to have an army to have meat? Because to have meat, you got to graze your animals. That takes a lot of land. So we're going to have to cut out a canticle of our neighbor's land. So we're going to need an army. Oh, okay. And we're also going to need doctors. Why does eating meat necessitate doctors? Because it's an unhealthy diet. People are going to get sick more easily, so we're going to need doctors. So now we've finally found the origin of sickness and war. That's what he says in the Republic. So I know a lot of environmentalists say one of the biggest things you can do if you want to reduce your imprint on nature is just eat vegetarian. Don't eat meat, because it takes so much more water and grains to feed the animal to get the meat than if you just drank the water and ate the grains yourself.
Yeah, I've heard it takes 1,000 gallons of water to make 1 pound of beef.
Wow.
Yeah. And I fancy myself an environmentalist and a mystic, and we are all one and all that jazz. But I also lived for 4 years in Texas. I love red meat.
Oh, yeah, I grew up eating meat. I did stop eating it, but I definitely, my whole family was, and it continues to be, a big meat-loving group of humanoids.
One of my favorite public intellectuals today is Chris Hedges, and he gave up meat for that exact reason, because of the ecological devastation it perpetuates.
Right.
And that's why Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum in the Great Reset, part of the Great Reset is that we will all eat bugs.
Oh, yeah.
Because insect protein uses a lot less meat and has a lot lighter carbon footprint.
Oh, yeah, sure. I agree with that, but why eat the poor bugs? You can just eat vegetarian and get all the protein you need, but I guess they're assuming if you must eat a living, moving creature, I mean, plants are alive too. You got to kill to live. That's a simple fact. But
well, when you taught me how to weightlift and helped me hook up getting prasadam from the food truck at University of Hawaii from the ISKCON temple in Honolulu.
Yeah, Govindas.
I was eating vegetarian almost exclusively.
Yeah.
And lifting and running and bicycling, and I was ripped.
Yeah. I mean, I was as big as I've ever been in my life from muscle when we were working at Govindas. I was 199 pounds. Normally I hover right around 180. But we had the gym there, and we had that Govinda's sumptuous vegetarian food. So I was eating a lot and working out a lot. It was just, so the myth that you can't be big and muscular in Western on a vegetarian diet was proven false by Govinda's food trailer.
Yes.
In the University of Hawaii in Manoa gym.
Yeah, I remember when we were getting to know each other and you took off your shirt and you had a wife beater underneath and your biceps were fucking enormous. And I was, wow, where'd you get those? I didn't know we were going to the gun show. I didn't buy a ticket.
Yeah, right.
And you said, yeah, my bicep boobs.
Yeah.
Thunder, meet the lightning.
Yeah. In the Hare Krishnas, it's Jaya and Vijaya. Those are the doormen of the spiritual world. I saw some other guy that we would go chanting Hare Krishna on the streets, and you get messed with by drunken tourists on
Sure.
Waikiki. And I didn't say the Jaya Vijaya. It was that. Remember that bald-headed guy? He had a son. His name was Balaram, I think. Anyway, he was like, "Yeah, they come. It wasn't Bali. The guy's name's Balaram."
Mm-hmm.
But he was like, "What happens if they mess with you?" Jaya Vijaya.
Yeah.
And then I got whacked in the head that very night with a rolled up newspaper.
Well, that's better than a bicep or a 2x4.
Yeah, right.
Getting back to our essay, my essay at stonefruit.substack.com, I have a long quote of Descartes' method. It's a 4-part method, and any listeners that want to check it out are welcome to go to Substack. And it's a very succinct description of what grew into the scientific method. And with these new methods of inquiry combined with new inventions, it was an ever-growing body of evidence that a new and better era had emerged. And of course, in addition to Bacon and Descartes, you got to throw in Copernicus, Galileo, whose quote set us off, or Camus' quote about Galileo set us off, and good old Newton. And Newton wrote a letter in which he said, "What Descartes did was a good step. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," which is his paean to progress, that each intellectual heavyweight is accomplishing what they are because they are standing on the shoulders of other intellectual heavyweights. And as the Enlightenment progressed, they thought that since they had discovered regular and uniform laws in the natural universe, maybe they could find regular and uniform laws in the social universe. And then they could apply those laws towards the perfectibility of man. The Enlightenment, the 18th century, was optimistic. The great prophets of the crisis of modernity, like Marx and Nietzsche, wouldn't come until a century later. But an explicit debate about the perfectibility of man first emerged in the late 17th century in the French Academy, and it was called the Quarrel of the Ancients and the Moderns. And it continued to the Royal Society in London in the early 18th century, where it was called by Jonathan Swift the Battle of the Books. And actually, Swift took the side of the ancients, which surprises me because he's such a master of irony. And irony is so central to modernity in my mind, because I also come at the history of acting as a writer too.
The ultimate master of irony was Socrates. He's always being ironic. He's never giving you a straight answer. He always insults you by complimenting you.
Oh, you want a feverish city?
Yeah, well, exactly like that. Or when he heard in the apology, he's getting sentenced to death for believing in gods of his own invention and corrupting the youth. And he's like, well, you've heard the story that my friend asked the oracle at Delphi, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle said, no one's wiser than Socrates. He says, oh, well, I heard that, and I knew that it wasn't true, so I went out to prove the god wrong, and I figured, I'll just go to some famously wise man and ask him, what is wisdom? So I did, and I asked him. And he says, you come to the right place, Socrates. I'm going to tell you exactly what wisdom is. And then he gave an example of something wise. And then Socrates' ironic response was, oh, great, whoever you are, you have such a reputation for wisdom. Your mind is so wonderful. It seems cruel of you to be so demeaning and patronizing to me, to make fun of me, to give me such a despicable answer as that. So please stop making fun of me and just give me a straight answer. So he knew the guy gave him an answer he thought was straight. And Socrates ironically pretends that he's just teasing him with this childish answer, and he's waiting for the appropriate answer. But then he goes, then I realized he didn't know. And I asked the carpenters, and they knew a lot about carpentry. They didn't know a lot about wisdom. And then I realized, oh, I'm the wisest, because at least I know I'm not wise. And everybody else, they think they are wise. So, but at any rate, he's definitely ironic, which makes it notoriously difficult to know what Socrates actually believes, and even more difficult to know what Plato believes, because he's writing through the mouth of Socrates, who is himself duplicitous and ironic all the time. But little props for Socrates and Plato.
Socrates reminds me of an ancient Columbo. Because at the end of every episode,
yeah, one eye shooting at the
not that part. The part where the end of every episode of Columbo, Peter Falk, one of the great actors, everyone go watch his movies with John Cassavetes, the godfather of independent film. But Peter Falk playing Columbo, end of every episode, he goes, just wait a minute, there's one more thing.
Right, yeah, that's what Socrates would do. He almost leaves the room and he's like,
yeah,
wait a minute.
You think he's done done investigating, he's done with the situation. Just one more thing. But he already knows where he's going to take the conversation and how he's going to trap who he's interrogating.
Yeah.
And Socrates is the same way. He'll play dumb a little bit.
Yeah, right.
Draw the person he's interrogating in, but he's already got the plan and the trap set.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Protagoras, one more thing.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent answer, oh noble Protagoras. Thank you for clearing that up for me. But there's just one little problem about your answer.
Something just popped into my mind.
Yeah, that's probably nothing. A great wise man like you could clear it up in a second. I submit to you this question.
And then, boom! Yeah, so the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns in France, or the battle of the books in UK, were similar. And the one side were people who said that the aesthetic and intellectual achievements of antiquity had never been surpassed. They've been enjoying millennia of opprobrium in Europe, and that nothing that the moderns would do would ever surpass it. And even in France and the UK, they said, well, maybe in arts and letters and philosophy, we'll never surpass the ancients. But they did say in the natural sciences, we clearly are. So that, even though that was one of the first modern iterations of the idea of progress in the Western mind, they were still leaning more heavily on, well, look at what we're doing in natural science. And we're still kind of giving arts, letters, philosophy, and the humanities to antiquity. In France, we'd look at people like Charles Perrault or Fontenelle as some of the great leaders of modernity. There's links to treatises like Perrault's Parallel of the Ancients and the Moderns with regards to the arts and sciences. By now we're into 1688. And in his preface to the Digression on the Ancients and Moderns, Fontenelle wrote about the veneration of ancient sources as it's a prestige game. And it denies the obvious, quote, beauty of our century, on which heaven has bestowed 1,000 distinctions, altogether refused to antiquity, that I've been unable to restrain a sense of veritable indignation. But in that same piece, Fontenelle suggested that if the ancients' brains were so much bigger, then the trees should have been bigger as well. Everything should have been bigger. But he established the modern worldview by the 18th century. Quote, mankind has advanced in culture, is now advancing, and will continue to advance during a long future ahead. And this advance is a result solely of natural and human causes. He said eloquence and poetry depend less on an accumulation of knowledge than do, quote, natural philosophy, physic, and mathematic, which is always improving. So that's the groundwork laid for the modern idea of progress in Renaissance humanism. But then let us meander towards the Enlightenment. Some of our favorite thinkers.
I want to comment on something that he said about if the ancients' brains were bigger, the trees should have been bigger.
Yeah.
That just reminds me of the Vedanta philosophy of Hinduism, where their idea of time is a big cycle. It's about 4 million years, a repeating cycle of 4 ages, the yugas. And the first age lasts about 1.8 million years. It's called Satya Yuga, the age of truth. And in that age, people we're in the 4th age is Kali Yuga, where the average height of a man or a tall man is 6 feet tall. In Satya Yuga, it was 60 feet tall, and they lived to be 100,000 years old. And all of the other species were proportionately larger and longer lived. And then in the next Yuga, Treta Yuga, it lasts, I think, 1.2 million years. They can be up to 30 feet tall, and they last for 10,000 years. And every other species is equivalently bigger and longer lived. Then in Dwapara Yuga, which is 848,000 years, they can be 15 feet tall. They live to be 1,000 years old. That ended 5,000 years ago. And then in this age of sin, Kali Yuga, which started 5,000 years ago, 6 feet tall, 100 years. This is about as much as you can hope for. And all the other species are similarly scrawny. And then people point to Genesis, where they talk about the race of giants, and people live to be 1,000 years old, like Methuselah. And then gradually they started, going down 800, 700, 600 years. So it's just that idea of having bigger brains and bigger trees. It is in Indian philosophy, the Vedanta philosophy, which is equivalent to Plato's philosophy in the West. So for a Hindu, progress, yeah, there's some progress, but the ultimate model of historical time is a circle, with 2 million year long circle. And so if you go back 1 million years, civilization was much, much more advanced. They had traffic with other planets via spaceships and via subtle material bodily projections. And in the first Yuga, Satya Yuga, they're so advanced they had no technology. They didn't need it. They could do everything with their subtle material body. And so they lived in the jungle with no houses because they were self-sufficient. They realized that the material world is an illusion, and they can just be spiritually satisfied spacemen sitting in a yogic trance, shooting themselves all over the universe. So just bringing a little wackiness there.
Yeah, and the whole Western idea of progress is entirely linear, and it completely ignores any possibility that time might be cyclical.
Right, which flies in the face of reason. Everything else about time is cyclical.
Do you follow the work of Graham Hancock at all?
Yeah, I recently, because he had his series come out on Netflix, and my brother and his wife were watching it, and I looked at it. It reminded me of what I was just saying. What 12,000 years ago there was some cataclysm, and so some great civilization ended. I mean, as a Hare Krishna, I buy into all that kind of stuff. But as an academic, I'm like, well, I don't know what where the evidence is. It's a matter of religious faith for me. But yeah, I have heard about that guy.
Well,
I just saw Russell Brand interview him.
Russell Brand interviewed him. Rogan interviewed him.
Okay, yeah.
Mike Tyson has a great podcast, Hot Boxing.
Oh, really?
He interviewed him.
Wow.
And part of Hancock's evidence is his main object of study, monumental Neolithic stone structures.
Right.
And some of the corresponding, especially oral folklore around them. And these monumental stone structures are all over the world, and a lot of them have a corresponding oral philosophy history that they were made by giants.
Yeah, right.
Which, I mean, how else are you going to lift a 50-ton block 5,000 times to make one of the pyramids of Giza?
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe they were. Well, let's see, 12,000 years ago. So, according to the Hindus, the previous yuga, where people were 15 feet tall, lived to be 1,000, lasted up until 5,000 years ago. So, you don't even have to go back 12,000. You only have to go back 5,000 years for that. It was the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is convincing Arjuna to fight the big battle of Kurukshetra. Arjuna didn't want to, not only because he didn't want to kill his kinsmen on both sides of the civil war, but because he knew that battle was going to kill the Kshatriya caste, the warrior administrative caste, and that would lead to the downfall of the Vedic civilization, which would inaugurate Kali Yuga. And Krishna says, yeah, so what? It's time. Don't be attached to the fruits of your results. You just do your duty and let the chips fall where they may. So then Arjuna said, okay, let's do it. But before he did, he said, let me see your universal form. I've heard about it. And then Krishna says, here it is. And Arjuna saw all of the heads of Vishnu devouring all the planets in these horrific flaming mouths and all the soldiers. And then Krishna says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And you know where that quote became very famous.
Right after Robert Oppenheimer, the chief architect of the Manhattan Project, the World War II project to make the first atomic bomb, had their first test in the desert of New Mexico.
Yeah, the Trinity site. And that's what he said, because he learned Sanskrit so he could read the Bhagavad Gita in its original. And that's what he then later, 20 years later, on the anniversary on NBC, he had the tear coming down his eye. And I remember the prince asked Vishnu, it's usually translated as now I am become time, Kala, destroyer of worlds, but he translated it as death.
He's a really interesting fellow who had as profound an interest in French poetry, Vedantic philosophy as he had in nuclear physics.
Yeah, a lot of those physicists were into the Vedanta philosophy. Schrödinger especially, and
then he got hassled by Congress as a communist. Jesus Christ, he's made America the atomic bomb, and he's a communist.
Yeah, right. Yep. Yeah.
Here's a pithy little paragraph I wrote in an earlier that I've used a couple times in this series. The divine providence immanent in the unfolding of history may have been placed there by God, but it required human activity to actualize itself. God gave man reason, which enabled societies to progress as individuals do in knowledge and skill as they age. But this conception of progress presupposes an indefinitely expanding maturity that is never followed by decline, old age, and death, like the human organism or any natural organism. And as you mentioned, David Hume a bit earlier, in his political discourses, by now we're into 1752, he said the universe, like an animal body, had a natural progress from infancy to old age, yet it must still be uncertain whether at present it be advancing to its point of perfection or declining, from whence we cannot presuppose any decay in human nature. Another one,
It's still a linear thing. It just has
it stops at maturity.
Yeah, it's not a line, it's a curve, but
Yeah.
it's from the past to the future. It's not a circle.
Right. And one of the other philosophers of the Enlightenment, Turgot, he wrote in a philosophical review of the successive advances of the human mind, 1750. Thus, the human race, considered over the period since its origin, appears to the eye of the philosopher as one vast whole, which itself, like each individual, has its infancy and its advancement. But since the Enlightenment was so optimistic, it just stayed in advancement gear and never decayed. So the leading lights of the Enlightenment believed that if we could discover consistent and uniform laws in the natural world, we could discover them in the human world. And another philosopher, Condorcet, wrote in an outline of a historical view of the progress of the human mind. And this was during the French Revolution. What a turbulent time that was. He fell out with the leaders of that moment of the French Revolution, and he wrote this in hiding, and then they found him and he got whacked. So this came out posthumously in 1795. And he wrote, "The only foundation of faith in the natural sciences is the principle that the general laws, known or unknown, which regulate the phenomena of the universe, are regular and constant, and why this principle, applicable to the other operations of nature, be less true when applied to the development of the intellectual and moral faculties of man."
Well, you know what? David Hume commented specifically on that assumption that the laws of nature are regular and constant. Hume said, first of all, as an empiricist, to have knowledge, you have to have contact with something material through your 5 sense organs. You have to be able to see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it. And even the material world, he says, we have no empirical proof that there is any material world. All we ever experience are our own sense perceptions. Because before him, Bishop Berkeley said that. He goes, there is no such thing as matter. There's only ideas in the mind and the minds that perceive them. You can't prove that there's a material thing outside of an observing mind. Even the attempt to prove it renders it impossible, because you've just, there's a tree outside this window, even if I don't look at it. Oh yeah, prove it to me. Look, it's in your mind. I tell my students, if you want to win some money at a bar, there's a foolproof trick. And you can say that, it's impossible to prove that matter exists outside of an observing mind, because it really is. It's impossible to prove. It seems likely that it's there, whether you're observing it or not. But then quantum physics would indicate it's a wave of probability until you observe it. But at any rate, to back to Hume, he's like, Newton didn't discover eternal forms of reason like Plato talked about. He observed the material world, and he saw that the way things unfold in the past regularly repeats itself. Common sense would indicate it will continue to repeat itself into the infinite future, but that's an assumption. It might be a safe assumption, but you can't know that for certain. And you can't know that the same laws of physics held in the infinite past. Maybe they last for 10,000 years, but before they were different, and in the future they'll be different again. I know modern physics and string theory says it's more like that the fundamental laws of physics change depending on where your universe is in the cosmic landscape. This is Leonard Susskind. But David Hume was saying, there's no such thing as a law of nature. You can't see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it. There's no proof that there's such a thing as a self, some continuous eternal self that stays the same from moment to moment. And so to think that we've, through human reason and science, have uncovered the eternal, unchanging laws of the universe, he says, is an erroneous assumption. Not that the laws of nature that Newton discovered aren't wonderful and helpful to the human being, but they're not the eternal forms of knowledge that Plato was talking about. That's what the rationalists believe, and he was an empiricist. He says there's no even the concepts of space and time are figments of the human imagination, because you can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear time or space or the laws of cause and effect. There's no causal link that I can perceive with my bodily sense organs. So they call David Hume the wrecking ball. He destroyed all presuppositions and presumptions of eternal knowledge. And then Kant responded to Hume. But at any rate, what Condorcet wrote, Hume attacked that idea.
I said, Hume was definitely a bad motherfucker.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
While I do not have the profundity of your contact with Western and Eastern philosophy, the area that I do have the most contact with is epistemology. And I usually see Locke and Berkeley lumped in with Hume as the empiricists.
Yeah, the British empiricists.
Mm-hmm. Although Hume was Scottish, I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
Hume, Adam Smith, the Scottish Enlightenment was pretty badass.
Yeah. You know who else was Scottish? James Clerk Maxwell, who discovered the electromagnetic force. He discovered that light is a combination of electricity and magnetism. And then,
which is part of what began to destroy Newtonian physics and create a new paradigm. But we'll get to Thomas Kuhn a little later, the great philosopher of science.
Yeah.
For me, the big pivot in the Enlightenment is, okay, it's the first modern secular version of progress. But while they're subtracting divine from divine providence, they're still leaving something like providence behind as a deus ex machina, which they call immanence, or the unfolding of historical laws. And Kant, in idea of a universal history from a cosmopolitical point of view, and I've seen it, the title described in different ways, translated in different ways. He said it might be possible to have a history with a definite natural plan for creatures with no plan of their own, which kind of boggles my mind. How can history itself have a plan? How can it have an intention when it's an abstract noun? And to go to the king of philosophers about abstract nouns having intentionality, we have to go to Brother Hegel, who in his lectures on the philosophy of history, which his students compiled from his lectures in 1822, 1828, and 1830, published 1837, Hegel, quote, "World history is governed by an ultimate design. That is, it is a rational process whose rationality is not that of a particular subject, but a divine and absolute reason divine reason. It sounds like a oxymoron or a conundrum. This is the proposition whose truth we must assume. Aha, foundation. Its proof lies in the study of world history itself, which is the image and enactment of reason. Reason is self-sufficient and contains its end within itself. It brings itself into existence and carries itself into effect. So we've evicted God in the modern worldview, but then we've returned God with these abstract secular nouns having some way to be intentional and some way to guide history.
And Hegel did exactly what you're saying, but then occasionally he would just say that reason is God. But he would shy away from saying that, and he preferred the word idea or Geist, spirit. He would have different words, that the idea in space is nature, the idea in time is history. But yeah, his whole idea of history is it is the incarnation of God's own process of self-realization. But that God's already self-realized, but that eternal self-realization manifests temporally in the material world through history, and specifically through the development of the nation states. And that the goal of history is to have is freedom. This is a big point. And to have a free state, the state has to be ruled by laws that are inherent in every soul. So that when you obey the laws of the state, you're really only obeying your own most inner law. That's freedom, obeying your own law. So when the state law corresponds to the law that's eternally inscribed on the human soul, that's the goal of history. That's progress. But I prepped before our talk. I just wanted to read a couple of cool quotes from Hegel, which can even make this more. So here's my book. You wanted me to plug my book? I'm going to plug my book. So this guy, have you ever seen this picture here before on the internet?
I have not.
It was popular, really popular, like back in 2018 when I got this published. So my publisher asked the guy, can we use that for the cover? He's like, yeah, just mention my name. I forget his name, but it's written in here somewhere. All right, so here's Hegel. So this book, Psyche and Singularity, I'm arguing that the gravitational singularity that was discovered inherent in Einstein's theory of gravity, general relativity, by Carl Schwarzschild in 1916, I'm saying that is what Plato called the idea of the good. It's the soul, it's the psyche, or it's God, and that all of the individual souls are subsidiary gravitational singularities that participate in the omnicentric singularity. So each sentient being is a point of infinite gravity. And with that in mind, here's what Hegel says. You know what? I would have to go look back in the notes to see which book this is from. But he says, just as gravity is the substance of matter, so also can it be said that freedom is the substance of spirit. Matter possesses gravity insofar as it is impelled to move towards a central point. It is essentially composite and consists entirely of discrete parts which all tend toward a center. Thus, matter has no unity. Spirit, on the other hand, is such that its center is within itself. It too strives towards its center, but it has its center within itself. Matter has its substance outside itself. Spirit, on the other hand, is self-sufficient being, which is the same thing as freedom. So matter, this essence is gravity, because it's made of different parts. It's composed of separate parts, and they all tend toward a center. Spirit also tends toward its center, but its center is within itself. A gravitational singularity is an infinite point of gravity. It has no extension in space, just like Descartes' idea of a self, and yet it's contracting into itself at an infinite rate. So it does seek its center, the center which is itself, which is the source of all space and time. And according to holographic string theory, the singularity also exists at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, or from our geocentric perspective on Earth, it's the outermost sphere where space-time is expanding away from us at the speed of light. And the past, the present, and the future are interwoven at each point of that encompassing sphere, which indicates that each point of that sphere is the singularity, which contains the past, present, and future, the whole universe. And then it radiates back in on these fundamental elastic strings of energy to create this cinematic hologram, this holographic movie that we call history. So that brought science full circle back to Plato, who says the exact same thing, and so does the Vedanta philosophy. But in the Timaeus, which guided the mind of the Middle Ages, universe is a sphere, the soul is a central point that also encompasses the periphery. So with that in mind, here is what Hegel, how he defines the idea. The idea is the central point, which is also the periphery, the source of light, so there's the Big Bang, which in all its expansion does not come without itself, but remains present and immanent within itself. Thus it is both a system of necessity and its own necessity, which also constitutes its freedom. So those are just a couple of excerpts from Hegel about what spirit is, and history is the progress of the human mind, which is the only rational mind on Earth, organizing itself into nation states, and then each of the nation states represents a certain phase of the development of God's rational mind. And then individuals within those nation states, the heroes, they incarnate the appropriate aspect of God's process of self-development for that time period. And once they finish their mission, then they fall away like a husk, and they get killed like Caesar, or deported like Napoleon, or they die young like Alexander. Those were his three examples. But I think with the evolution of 20th century physics, you were reading, they're saying that's how the moderns are better than the ancients. At least we have mathematique and physique. That evolution, which really started with Plato's Republic, culminated in holographic string theory and this idea of a singularity to guide a nation state based on the assumption that each rational soul, or all souls, not even the ones who are in a rational human body, are one with this omnicentric singularity. A state that could guide its laws based on that realization would fulfill Hegel's idea of the progress of human history, based on what we just read there about how he defines the ideas. He contrasts it with gravity, yet I'm saying it's the archetype of gravity, of singularity. So there's my spiel for that.
I like your spiel, and I think your analysis of Hegel highlights that he seems to feel that the nation state is required for reason, or the human mind, or spirit, or in German Geist, to unfold. Would you say that's a fair synopsis of one of the key ideas of Hegel?
Yeah, I think so. Everything comes from the idea, which is the source of light. Just like Plato's idea of the good, it's the source of light in the material world, and it's the source of consciousness in the spiritual world. So all the animal species, they're also part of God. But what history is the evolution of all of the necessary phases of God's self-development. So God is self-sufficient. Within the idea, all of the phases are already complete, but they manifest temporally in history through the human rational mind as it organizes itself in nation states. So like the quote before about, I think it was from Kant, how the individual doesn't have a plan, but history does. That's similar to what Hegel was saying. And he was responding to Kant. He was picking up after Kant. He agreed with Hume. Oh yeah, the laws of nature as they are now, they're not eternally fixed. Hegel said they are an eternally fixed point on the evolution of the idea through history. And each of those phases is eternal. And but they're all one step in this progressive march of the idea of realizing itself through history. So we saw Kant thought Isaac Newton's laws of physics were the eternal ideas that'll never change, and that Newtonian concepts of space and time and causality were imprinted as a priori categories of thought in the human mind. Hegel said no, that they are just one step in a historical progression of the understanding of nature. And then we saw, of course, with Einstein, the idea of space and time got fused together into a space-time, and the idea of causality got thrown out the window because the past, the present, and future coexist. The passage of time is an illusion, however persistent. There's a paraphrase from Einstein's quote to one of his colleagues' widow when her husband died. He's like, don't worry, it only seems like he died. Every moment in history is eternal. That's relativity theory, which really complicates the idea of linear progress of history, because it says very clearly that whatever the end goal is there. And all of the points along the timeline back to the beginning, I guess at the Big Bang, they're all co-eternal. And then holographic string theory says, yeah, they're co-eternal specifically at each point of the encompassing sphere of the universe, which again brings us all the way full circle back to Plato, with now the precision of the mathematics that he himself set up in the original academy. So I do see a progress of history. And as it progresses, you come to realize that history is an illusion because all the points of history are eternal. But from our human perspective, it definitely seems like there's a developmental process.
A developmental process that is mediated by the formation of modern nation states. And yep. I see you as a philosopher, and I see myself as more of a historian or a sociologist. And this is the halftime book plugging section of the Hot Robin according to Stone Fruit. This is my book, A Policy History of Standards-Based Education in America. And I would consider it a work of history, sociology, or historical sociology. And that's why I wanted to spend some time in the Enlightenment, because it laid out so many of the most salient contours of modernity, like the nation state. And again, I keep coming back to the Peace of Westphalia, which ended a period of international warfare throughout Europe. I believe in 1663. I could have that wrong, but the correct link is in stonefruit.substack.com. But it established principles that were crucial to modern international relations, including the inviolability of borders and non-interference in domestic affairs, sovereignty of states. Central banking came into being in the Enlightenment, first with Sweden's Riksbank in 1668 and the Bank of England in 1694. Corporations came into being in the Enlightenment with the English East India Company in 1600 and the Dutch East Indies Company in 1602. You know what tripped me out in doing the research for one of the many things that tripped me out in doing the research for this series and these podcasts is how much bigger the Dutch East Indies Company was than the English East India Company.
Right.
Magnitudes of, I forget the exact multiple, but many multiples larger in terms of tonnage of freight brought back from Asia to Europe.
Right.
And these were the archetypical modern corporations, and allowed for the concentration of capital, transferability of shares, management separate from ownership, and eventually, with later laws, immortality and liability protections, and the notion of corporate personhood. And as this idea of progress, going from infancy, youth to maturity, and staying at maturity forever, so too would corporations live forever, be immortal persons. So if the legal fiction is that corporations are persons, it is a fair question to ask what kind of person are corporations? What kind of people are corporations? And there
Good
was
people.
what?
Rich. They're good people. Rich people.
They're Calvinism. They're good because they're rich. Their
Proves
richness
it.
is proof of their goodness.
Krishna doesn't award psychopaths lots of money and power and immortality.
Well, the West does. And there's a great book called The Corporation, and it was turned into a documentary called The Corporation in 2003. But the documentary focused just on the notion of corporate personhood. It didn't cover as much ground as the book did. And back in 2003, medicine and psychiatry and psychology had the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4. That is the absolute Bible of how medicine and psychiatry diagnose mental conditions. And in the DSM-4, they still called it psychopath. DSM-5, which is what we're under now, they don't use the word psychopath anymore, and the definition is a little different. But I'm going to use DSM-4 because I like it more.
By the way, I read this first one, and I'm sorry to tell you, Dr. Boyce Brown, but it applies to more than just corporations. It applies to a couple of fellows that I think both of us are very familiar with.
Yes.
Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors is indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. Well, well, it depends on what society that you're living in, whether you conform to the social norms that could get you arrested or not, right? You can't be a psychonaut and not be a psychopath, according to this.
Keep reading.
Deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Okay, that doesn't apply to us. Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. Even though I took a political science degree with concentration in alternative future studies, still, I'm guilty sometimes of that. Irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. Reckless disregard for safety of self or others. Consistent irresponsibility is indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations, and lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from others. So that doesn't apply to us, but gosh darn if it doesn't apply to most corporations today.
Yes.
Even though most recently during the pandemic, we were instructed by our benevolent leader to look to the pharmaceutical corporations as our most trustworthy and beneficent savior, not as if they had been convicted of intentionally addicting people to opioids and causing the deaths of thousands prior to that, but that when the whole pandemic hit, and then there was the mandate of the vaccines, I just recalled my time at the University of Hawaii when almost every political science class I took was about how evil corporations are. And yet it was those same liberal college professors who were really pushing hard the mandate from the pharmaceutical corporations to take the vaccines that they were supplying. And I just said, well, just back in 2008, you were hammering into my head that these are the incarnate devils of the earth. They're the rapacious devourers of planet Earth itself. They're the psychopathic evil corporations. Now all of a sudden, bow down, bend the knee. Corporations are your friend. It didn't sit well with me, the total flip-flop on the trustworthiness of corporations. I look at corporations and their influence kind of like, what was that movie with the plant that would eat people? the musical Seymour, Feed Me Seymour.
Little Shop of Horrors.
Little Shop of Horrors, Feed Me Seymour. So the military-industrial complex, with which I have a loving relationship because it fed me since my dad worked for Lockheed Martin and Martin Marietta before it merged with Lockheed. I don't like to, I like to think of it as hate the game, not the player, And also, you needed the military-industrial complex in World War II. That's how we developed the nuclear bomb. I mean, the Los Alamos project, it was impossible without some kind of enormous corporatocracy and mobilization of all of these financial and industrial forces. So it was necessary to do. But then, as Eisenhower said, as he was leaving office, beware the military-industrial complex. That this is the thing. And who would be more competent to comment on that than General Eisenhower, leader of the Allied forces, who then was president of the United States? There's not a single human on earth more qualified to comment on the potential dangers of the military-industrial complex with the arms manufacturing corporations. And you got big pharma, you got the military-industrial complex. It seems those two alone control. And then you've got big banking and big ag. All the big corporations seem to be accelerating all of the spiritual and concomitant environmental problems that we have today.
Yes. And everything that you just read, irresponsibility, lack of remorse, etc., that is straight out of DSM-4 about how to diagnose human beings.
Right.
But it provides a perfect diagnosis for the behavior of corporations as well.
And what else? It also describes political parties and religious groups, any groups of people. Carl Jung said that the sense of individual moral responsibility is in an inverse relationship to the size of the group. If you're in a group of 100 people, then if that mob murders somebody, you don't really feel responsible. You're just one among many. You're 1/100th responsible. So if you're in a political party with 75 million people in it, then you feel zero responsibility. You feel 1/75 millionth of a percent of responsibility for any of the horrors that your political party see. And then you project the shadow of your group onto the other group so that you defend everything your group does and see all evil in the other group. I mean, that defines politics in general, and especially the two-party the politics of the United States of America today. I'd say the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they're just as psychopathic as the corporations.
Yeah, and a big point of my series on the Western idea of progress is that now, beginning with the Enlightenment and these archetypical corporations, and now corporations control politics completely.
Yeah, right.
So you have a diagnosably psychopathic entity that has structured everything in the West, politically, economically, to a large extent socially. It's psychopathic. Psychopathic entities have structured the West, and they are the entities guiding, quote unquote, progress in this endless pursuit of creature comforts. And the hypocrisy you cited is indeed mind-blowing, because the left used to be the guardians of free speech and civil liberties. And now with the Twitter files of the investigative journalists like Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, Li Fong, and others have found out through the primary sources of the emails and Slacks and tweets of the interaction between the FBI and the national security state and big tech to control a narrative, to create a consensus reality. And the big tech donates to the Democratic Party at almost a 99%. So big tech is enormously partisan. And this side of the spectrum of politics in America that used to be advocating for free speech now advocates for deplatforming people under the guise of bullshit of disinformation, misinformation. And they used to be against corporations, and now they're for exact ones you mentioned, like Big Pharma. And they're colluding together to create the consensus reality in which we're supposed to live and make decisions. And conversely, while the left didn't do anything to promote Medicare for all or any other progressive goal, when right before Pelosi wanted to become Speaker of the House, didn't use their leverage at all. About the same number of people that were in the Republican Freedom Caucus, and the Republican Freedom Caucus used their leverage, even though they were only about 20-ish, same as the so-called progressives and the squad on the left. The Republicans used their leverage to extract significant demands, among which was a $75 billion potential cut to the military-industrial complex, to the I don't even call it, it's not the defense budget, it's the offense budget. America has not fought a defensive war since 1812. And yeah, okay, we might have needed it in World War II, but people like Allen Dulles, when he was working for OSS, Operation of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA during World War II, was helping to fund both sides.
Yeah.
And he was stationed in Switzerland, and he was writing letters to German industrialists saying hello by Heil Hitler, or signing off by saying Heil Hitler, Allen Dulles.
Sure.
And
yeah, I mean,
and this goes, and other people like Prescott Bush, grandfather of George W. Bush, father of George H.W. Bush, when he worked at the investment bank Brown Brothers Harriman, he was another financier trying to fund both sides of World War II. And in fact, Prescott Bush was convicted under the Trading with the Enemy Act of World War II and was fined, I believe, $5 million, a lot of money back in the 40s. And in the end, due to his political influence, he was a senator, and he picked Nixon out of obscurity. He not only had the charges dropped, the fine waived, but got recompense for damages that the Allies inflicted on Germany.
Right.
As did Henry Ford, because the Allies bombed a Ford plant that was working for the Nazis in Germany. And the ancient dynastic banking families, who, to my mind, are at the apex of the pyramid of the control grid of the Western mind, the Rothschilds made their money funding both sides of the Napoleonic Wars.
Sure.
So the money changers create wars, create artificial scarcity to rob us of our natural ecstasy and a life of abundance and leisure that could easily be ours, or should I say, could have easily been ours, because we are out of resources to make it possible. And Eisenhower was indeed one of the greatest figures to conceive of the critique of the military-industrial complex. And that farewell address at the end of his two-term administration 70 years ago remains as prescient and abiding now as it was then. Although I would look to a refinement of the military-industrial complex presented by Ray McGovern, one of the founders of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, a guy who operated at the very highest levels of the CIA, who provided, I believe, Reagan and H.W. Bush, at least, possibly other presidents, with the CIA's Presidential Daily Brief. There is always one guy from the CIA who comes into the Oval Office and provides a daily intelligence briefing for the president, and Ray McGovern was one of them. But he has since advocated for sanity and not psychopathy. And his refinement of the military-industrial complex was what he called by the acronym the MICIMATT, the Military-Industrial Congressional Intelligence Congressional think tank. I'll put a link in the description of this YouTube. But the MICIMATT, he added a few more sectors: Congress, intelligence, think tanks, very important, corporations. These are the entities that are led by the psychopathic entities of corporation, providing us with the illusion of progress while they floor the Maserati of Western civilization right off a fucking cliff, which is exactly where we're at today. And the conventional notions of progress presuppose an indefinite exploitation of a finite biosphere. But because I am a mystic, even though I like to gnaw on dead animals and red meat, as we say in Texas, if you can kill it, you can grill it. The biosphere, everything is our relative. We are created by exploded stars, and we will become the substance of stars to explode in the future. And as a psychonaut, I've experienced this. As a religious mystic, I've experienced this. I don't believe it's true. I know it's true. Even stone and mineral, to my mind, is just energy condensed to a very mellow form. I think even stone has an element of sentience.
Stone fruit says.
Bada boom! Oh, you know where I one place that drove the planet drove that home to me. Dinosaur National Monument in Utah.
Yeah.
There are some very, very old rocks in Utah.
Yeah.
The area around Dinosaur National Monument is 300 million years old. And as the name would imply, there's a big patch of dinosaur finds there. And some stone near there goes back 2 billion years.
Okay.
About 2 hours west of Austin, Texas, there's Enchanted Rock. It's a little bubble of granite. I believe it is 1 billion years old. Ayers Rock, another bubble, I don't know of what type of mineral, in Australia, sacred to the Aboriginals, very old as well. If you've been to these places and you have a certain type of sensitivity, you can feel that even stone is sentient. And so we need to treat the biosphere as our relative instead of a natural resource, a term that has always filled me with burning hatred and frustration. But it's a way to abstract the biosphere and make it easier for us to exploit it. Like you said, that Jung said, that the larger the group, the less the individual personal responsibility. The more we abstract the natural world, the easier it is on our consciences to exploit it. But we're pushing up against the limits now in a world structured by psychopathic entities. And the best word, I'm not sure if I found it or I coined it, but omnicide. I've seen ecocide. I know I didn't coin that to destroy the ecology, the planet, but I would call it an omnicide. Progress in the modern world today is an omnicide. Side, root word, death. Omni, going in every direction. And the sad part is, powerful Tod Desmond, there is no way to install or trigger any type of corrective mechanism whatsoever at all.
Well, well, I mean, that would be, what kind of a corrective mechanism would you be thinking of? Some kind of a legislative solution, or
I'll tell
what do
you.
you? Okay.
For me, this is the skeleton key. And if we can't do this, we can't do anything else. It's the influence of money in politics in the so called Western democracies. Citizens United, the Supreme Court case in 2011, 2012, that declared that money is speech. And therefore, corporations spending money to influence the political process can spend as much as they want
Hmm.
in unlimited amounts to dark money outfits ad nauseum. Unlimited corporate spending to influence politics in so called Western democracies. Number one. Number two, public financing of elections. You need to raise a minimum of $500,000 to run for Congress in the United States. And presidential cycles now go into the billions of dollars for each candidate. And key Senate races like the one in Pennsylvania between Oz and Fetterman
In Georgia.
in Georgia. Boy, the Oz Fetterman, God love Fetterman. He was recovering from a stroke, but it really affected his speech and perhaps his cognition. We all hope brain plasticity is real and he recovers and all that. But it was a pitiful, pitiful debate to watch. But they each spent about $200 million.
Right. Yeah.
And so you have the ability of corporations to put as much money into politics as they want, campaigns costing a fortune. And until we solve those two things at a minimum, there is no chance whatsoever that we can self correct this omnicide that contemporary notions of progress are leading us toward. But there is in sociology the notion of path dependency, which is the simple idea that you're probably going to continue on a path that you're already on, especially if you're gaining a material benefit from it, which would be the third thing that needs to be destroyed: lobbyists.
Well, there goes my poor. It's a good thing my dad is already deceased, because he was
Yeah,
one of the top lobbyists for Lockheed
for the
Martin.
for the MICIMATT, for the military industrial complex. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I get what you're saying. It's don't hate the play, hate the game.
Yeah.
But every lobbyist becomes a interchangeable member of this endlessly self-replicating psychopathic entity. And who are the lobbyists? Typically former senators and Congress people. It's the revolving door between sitting in Congress and going to K Street, the mecca of lobbyists, because they've been members for a while. They know how to move the levers of power, but they do so not on behalf of the people or animal friends and stone friends and plant friends, but on behalf of corporations. So until we overturn Citizens United, until we have public financing of election, and until we put some kind of brakes on lobbyists, at least say if you're in Congress, you can never be a lobbyist, or at least you can't be a lobbyist for 10 years after you leave. Something like that.
Yeah.
Unless we do all three of those things, there's absolutely no hope whatsoever. And Americans have what some have called solutionitis. They hear these dark harbingers of the world to come, like myself or Chris Hedges or people of that ilk. And then I often I watch a ton of YouTube, Tod Desmond, and even the Q&As, and people always stand up, well, what's the solution?
Right.
There is none. Well, there is collective action, collective organizing, and those three things to get money out of politics. Those are the obvious answers, but they're never going to happen.
I've got a fourth thing.
Lay it on us. Lay it on our dozens of devoted listeners.
Yeah, all of you dozen devotees out there. The fourth solution is a fourth branch of government. Carl Jung said in the Middle Ages, the alchemists had a saying, which he called the red thread that permeates the Middle Ages. It was called the axiom of Maria. And it goes like this: from the one comes the two, from the two comes the three, from the three comes the four as the one. For whatever reason, that little saying was the ultimate maxim for 1,000 years of Western history. And he relates it to the mandala, which is the image of the ultimate archetype of the self, which Plato called the idea of the good. But using the axiom of Maria and looking at the three branches of government, first branch is Congress. And then the second branch is the executive branch, the president. And then the third branch is the judiciary, the Supreme Court. And from the Congress comes the president. They have to affirm it. That's what was the January 6th riot was supposed to stall that. And then the president nominates the Supreme Court. From the two comes the three. And then I'm saying the Supreme Court should nominate people to sit on the fourth branch of government. Their purpose, those first three are checks and balances to break up the power of factions, according to the Federalist Papers. The fourth branch would offset that focus on the separation of powers, and it would try to help the members of Congress especially to unite and overcome factions by having them explain the reasons for their legislative proposals in light of the equation psyche equals singularity. That you have to have some agreed upon first principle. If we have a fiction of corporations are humans, let's have another fiction. I don't think it's a fiction, but even if it is, it's a noble lie. Each of us is one with this omnicentric point of infinite power. Based on that first principle, which is Plato's idea of the good, if that's our nationally agreed upon definition of self, does your legislation propose to forward knowledge of that fundamental uniting equation? And the only bare criteria that they'd have to fit is a rational explanation based on that premise. And for example, Immanuel Kant, I told you I was going to prepare a quote from Kant. So I know we're getting into it, but Kant's whole idea was categorical imperative. How do you know if your actions are moral? You know if your actions are moral if they conform the idea of a universal law. Well, how do you do that? Well, take your suggested piece of legislation, distill it to a universal maxim, abstract from the particulars, and make it a universal law. So I want to steal from the bank because I'm poor and I need the money. Okay, let's just abstract from that. It's okay to steal if you feel like you need to. If you made that into a universal law, would that government be able to stand, or would it just destroy itself? And he would say it would destroy itself because people would steal from each other all the time. What's the point of society? So the fourth branch would have the legislators explain their legislation. How would your piece of legislation forward and help progress the knowledge that each of us is one with this central source of existence. And how would that, and then that legislation would fill in what Kant called, a kingdom of ends, a kingdom of ultimate purposes. And they would all harmonize with each other. Like Hegel said, freedom is when the laws of the state reflect the eternal laws imprinted on the soul, so that when you obey the state, you're really just obeying yourself. That's freedom. And I think a fourth branch of government with philosophers helping people make their arguments reasonable so that the premises line up with the arguments that support them, getting rid of all the logical fallacies like a straw man fallacy and circular reasoning and all the rhetorical tricks politicians constantly use, and the double standards both sides inevitably use, and the way both parties project their shadow completely on the other. The fourth branch would help to clean that up and just make the rational debate clean and actually reasonable. And then the divine light of reason would be allowed to shine, and human rational discourse could bring us to just legislation. So there you go. In addition to the three things that you mentioned, which I agree with, add a philosophical compass to the legislative process and professionals who are adept at understanding the laws of logic and argumentation. So then we'll be okay.
Then the omnicide will be quenched, will be doused.
Right, all that frenetic energy that you want to fill with buying useless crap, that energy will be more fulfillingly plugged into observing the legislative process, because it's all now rooted to this process of self-realization. So that this, even arguing with both sides, the process of arguing will just make this knowledge of self brighter and brighter. So it will, I believe that in this time of history, like Carl Jung said, the collective unconscious compensates the conscious mind, and the collective mind follows the same rules as the individual mind. And whenever your mind is pulled by opposing demands, the ultimate archetype of the self presents a mandala image to guide you towards wholeness through the union of opposites. The black hole and the inside-out black hole universe is nature's geometrically perfect mandala. And I believe this Leonard Susskind's black hole cosmology is the mandala image that's emerging in the mind now to guide us towards wholeness through the union of opposites. That's another part of that whole spiel. But something's got to happen, as you're saying. The omni-side, I think the solution to the omni-side is the omnicentric singularity.
You came to the University of Hawaii in large part to study with Jim Dator, one of the greatest futurists in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And while I did not study with him, I did rely on his work a lot. And this extremely fetching read has a conclusion on the possible futures of standards-based education in America. And academia being what it is, my conclusion was just about the only place I was allowed to exhibit original thought. And I, too, have a vision for a political future for United States and the world. But I don't think we're going to get there on purpose. I believe the reigning factoid is that 2/3 of Americans believe that we are going to have a civil war in the United States again. And gall darn it, I'm one of them. I think we're just teetering on the verge of it. It could happen in 2 years or in 20 years, but something like it is going to happen. Because, for example, back to the military-industrial complex, if military spending trends continue on the pace that they have since World War II, in only 5 or 6 years, military spending will crowd out all other federal discretionary spending. So they will only be spending on servicing the debt, the national debt, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the military. no other federal discretionary spending at all. So I don't anticipate any reduction in the military spending, although I sure hope the Freedom Caucus can, if not the 75 billion, at least some substantial cut. But since the military spending seems to me unlikely to ever materialize, what they're going to cut is Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. So not only will they drop every other federal program for discretionary spending, they'll start attacking Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. So then the federal government will exist to do nothing for the people. It already exists to do nothing for the people. The Republicans represent the focus fire on the middle class and the working class, and the Democrats represent the controlled demolition of the middle class and working class. And Joe Biden is obviously suffering rapid onset dementia and can barely get through a speech and probably doesn't know where he is half the time. But he fulfills a role, he plays a function. And his function is to, as does the rest of Congress, to do as little as possible for the people while forestalling social revolution. To do as much as is possible for the corporations and as little as is necessary to prevent revolution. That's his only function. That's Congress's only function. So once the people get it through their thick skulls that the government is not going to give them shit, and that is not giving them shit, never will give them any more shit, that they will feel allowed to disintegrate the social contract laid out by the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, especially Locke and Hobbes. And when they do, America will go, and probably the other representative democracies, so-called, of the so-called West, they will go through a period of tremendous political turmoil, political violence on a scale that dwarfs January 6th. And there's all sorts of political violence and labor unrest in Europe that is, of course, not getting into the mainstream media. That's happening now in Europe. And America's obviously a failed empire, is obviously and quite blatantly a gangster state now, in one example, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, providing energy from Russia to Germany and the rest of Europe.
Oh, but boys, clearly Putin did that. He blew up his own pipeline because he's like a dozer. Did you see Fraggle Rock when you were little?
That was a little after my youth.
Well, me too, but I watched it anyway after I got home from high school and indulged in herbal medicines. The little Fraggles lived underground, and they had these little creatures called dozers. And the dozers would create candy structures. They were little construction workers. And they would create elaborate buildings just so they could destroy them and eat them. And I think the Russians are kind of like the dozers. They just create pipelines so that they can blow them up and then rebuild them.
Well, I sense that you're actually being ironic and that you don't believe that. And in Nord Stream in particular, that went through Swedish territorial waters and Danish territorial waters. And It was a German-Russian project. So the Danes, the Swedes, and the Germans all did their own independent analyses of what happened. And if it had been the Russians, believe me, they would have been trumpeting that for the highest hill. But instead, what they said was, we cannot disclose any information resulting from our investigation because we don't want to jeopardize existing security arrangements with other nations.
Right.
And there was a enormous NATO naval exercise in the Baltic Sea, right around the island of, I believe it's called Balmholtz or Bolholm perhaps, which is a Danish island, and the USS Kearsarge stayed behind after the exercises. And you know who's good on this is not just conspiracy theorists like myself, but the eminent economist Jeffrey Sachs has been speaking very publicly about this as well. There was also radar evidence of American Sikorsky helicopters, typically stationed in Gdansk, Poland, remaining in the area. They did the naval exercises right over the area where Nord Stream was blown up. The Kearsarge aircraft carrier remained after. Numerous Sikorsky helicopters were tracked by radar, having hovered around the area of the bombing immediately prior to it. And guess what the purpose of the naval exercises were?
Naval demolition.
To defuse underwater bombs using unmanned underwater vehicles.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, you see the video of Biden. They asked him about it. He's like, if they put tanks and stuff in Ukraine, the Russians, then we're going to do away with the pipeline. And then the reporter lady, she said, how do you plan to do that? I mean, it's not your property. And he's like slyly grinning, saying, we have our ways, or believe me, it'll get done. So it was pretty much, you know,
admitted to.
Yeah. Yeah. With a wink and a nod.
And this is completely bipartisan. It's one party, it's an oligarchy, it's a duopoly, it's the money party, just two separate wings. Because, especially in foreign policy, because Condoleezza Rice said as much in 2014, I believe, that America needed to be the one to supply Europe with its energy. They needed to drive a wedge between Europe and Russia. And that was an overriding geopolitical goal of her team, but also of the blue team.
Well, so, yeah, they flipped, as you've said. The enantiodromia, Carl Jung's psychology of collective political parties, as with an individual, so with groups. If you're too one-sided, then your unconscious mind tries to compensate your one-sided ego by developing an equal and opposite unconscious motivation. And at a certain critical mass, it flips. And I think we saw that around the Trump era, because 20 years ago, the neocons, using Christian language of the Crusades, psyched up especially the Republicans to go fight the 20 years wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think the Republicans felt because they were the main dupes of the neocons' rhetoric. So they started to turn. And so then the neocons said, okay, you're going to turn on us, screw you, we're going back to the Democrats. And they replaced their Christian rhetoric with woke rhetoric. And you've probably seen some of the mockeries of it with the bombs on the planes with the rainbow flag colored on them. And so they pushed the same exact warmongering now using woke ideology, and the left wing predictably lapped it up. And now you see they're pushing war, and then you've got these 20 or whatever, the Freedom Caucus on the right, they're the anti-war. And so many people comment on that. But to me, it's evidence of what Jung said. It's this flipping of the roles, because both parties are by definition one-sided, left wing and right wing. So if Jung's correct, they're going to flip periodically. And I think we are watching that flip right now. The free speech left, the anti-war left, the anti-CIA, anti-FBI, anti-surveillance state left, the individual who doesn't conform left. They're the exact opposite now, it seems. And the right has adopted a lot of what the left used to adopt. Not all of it. There hasn't been a complete, I mean, there's still, the right wing is is pro-life, the left wing is pro-choice. But even on vaccines, the right was using the my body, my choice rhetoric, and the left was saying, no, you don't have the right over your own body when it comes to the welfare of everybody else. So at any rate, what interested me the most was this flipping of the roles, and that just seems to confirm Carl Jung's psychology of the individual and the collective mind. And the neocons always fascinate me because guess who their favorite philosophers are? Plato and Nietzsche. Just like me, only I believe they're tapped into the dark side of Plato and Nietzsche as presented by their guru Leo Strauss, who was front pages in all of the liberal newspapers in 2002, 2003. And they were the demons, literally the Hitlerian antichrists who were whispering in the king's ear and causing all these wars and all the surveillance state. And now the left has completely embraced the Lincoln Project and the neocons, Bill Kristol, with David Frum. And you don't hear anything about the Straussian neocons, the Leocons, and none of that. There was good writing 20 years ago about analyzing Leo Strauss and his interpretations of Plato and Nietzsche. That was like, wow, this is great. Finally, my field has entered mainstream political commentary. That's all gone now.
It's worth a brief sidebar to contemporary geopolitics to provide a context as we hurtle towards a conclusion of this progress about the contemporary landscape in which so-called progress is unfolding. So to finish up a little bit about Nord Stream and how it relates to geopolitics, in criminology, when we look for a suspect, we consider three things: motive, means, and opportunity. And the motive of blowing up Nord Stream was outlined by Condoleezza Rice nearly a decade ago, that the United States wanted to preserve the Atlanticist connection between the United States and Western Europe, kind of the G7, which includes Japan, but the G7 is, except for Japan, Western Europe and Canada and the United States, in favor so that Eurasia doesn't integrate. Because if Russia had been allowed to continue providing 40% of Germany's energy, so now Germany's being deindustrialized and facing an extremely cold winter, if the United States had not fought so hard to preserve the Atlanticist connection, in part by blowing up Nord Stream, then we would have seen a further integration of Eurasia, including Europe. So in my mind, there is a dyad of Russia, China. This is who's going to replace the West. And we'll get to what the West is later because we're closing in on 2 hours. So we'll move towards wrapping up. In my mind, the kernel of what will replace the West is the dyad Russia, China. Then the second circle outward is the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And numerous governments are trying to join and have observer status, notably Argentina, Saudi Arabia, a lot of heavy hitters, a lot of real heavy middleweights. And then the next row out is the 144 countries that have already signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which integrates Eurasia and Africa and South America through the maritime Silk Roads, through shipping lanes and ports and whatnot. But on the continents of Eurasia, the Belt and Road Initiative, financed by China, is practical concrete infrastructure, high-speed rail and pipeline, gas and oil pipelines, and I'm sure telecommunications lines, providing the practical basis for the powerful integration of Eurasia and the rest of the world, which is an incredible wedge that would have cleaved Western Europe away from the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but not just NATO itself, the entire Atlanticist project. So, motive, keep Western Europe as the vassals, not the allies, the vassals of the United States. Means, what you mentioned, Joe Biden. We've got ways. We've got ways of stopping the Nord Stream. Opportunity, the NATO exercises in the Baltic Sea in the weeks before the explosion. So America has become clearly a pure and obvious gangster state and is in the process of a bust out. So the mafia approaches businesses and says, give us money to protect you, when both parties know that it's not for protection. It's so that the mafia won't fuck with their businesses. But they fuck with them anyway. They take the money for protection, and then in a bust out, they just extract as much money as they can from legitimate or semi-legitimate businesses and just leave them as wreckage on the side of the road. And America is treating its closest and most dearly held allies in exactly the same way. America is a mafia state in the midst of a bust out, and that's the context of part 5 of at stonefruit.substack.com, the demise of progress in the waning years of peak anthropocene. Now, let us sally forth, jumping along in part 5 of the series. In the Renaissance, previous to the Renaissance, the philosophers of progress, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, they had a list, a material inventory. Walled cities, urbanization, domestication of animals, et cetera, et cetera. The kinds of things that anthropologists would say constitutes civilization. And now we had the great prophets of the crisis of modernity, like Marx, like Nietzsche. But after World War I and the industrial level slaughter that it entailed, you had other thinkers like Spengler, the decline of Western civilization, and that said that, progress is not as certain as it was in the Enlightenment, and that it is that it might be a decline. And that idea has only become more pervasive since World War I. And I encourage our dozen faithful listeners to go to section 5 of the series at stonefruit.substack.com, because I have a number of quotes from thinkers such as Locke and
Kant,
and
Nietzsche,
numerous others, talking about what they see as progress, but then also what they see as progress on its way out. And we can dally with one of the founding fathers, actually one I have a lot of respect for, a great polymath, Thomas Jefferson. He wrote in an 1820 letter to William Jarvis, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." And a lot of the thinkers in part 5 focus on education and understanding and conscience as modern social technologies that still allow for the continuity of the notion of progress. But then you have contrarians like our man Nietzsche, who in Schopenhauer as Educator wrote, "Your true nature lies not hidden deep within you, but immeasurably high above you, or at least above that which you normally take to be yourself." Your true educators and formative teachers reveal to you what the real raw material of your being is, something quite ineducable, yet in any case accessible only with difficulty, bound, paralyzed. Your educators can be only your liberators. And that is the secret of all education. And any Nietzsche fan is familiar with Walter Kaufmann's indispensable anthology, The Portable Nietzsche. And it has a wonderful little fragment. To educate the educators, but the first must educate themselves. And for these I write. But, you know, okay, I'm a sociologist, I'm a historian, I'm also an educator. I'm teaching now, but I'm a sociologist and a historian and a philosopher of education. And I've worked most often. My work in education has been in writing education law. So I have a varied experience in education from a lot of angles. And Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols lays down a juicy little philosophy of education. Educators are needed who have themselves been educated, superior, noble spirits, proved at every moment, proved by words and silence, representing culture which has grown ripe and sweet, not the learned louts whom secondary schools and universities today offer our youth as higher wet nurses. Educators are lacking, not counting the most exceptional of exceptions. Educators are required for 3 tasks. One must learn to see, one must learn to think, one must learn to speak and write. The goal in all 3 is a noble culture. And I'll tell you, as someone who spent, shnikey, how the time flies, pushing 25 years in education as an administrator, a law writer, a teacher, a professor, I'll tell you, that type of notion of the ends of education is entirely absent from all contemporary education, especially in the West. And absent that kind of education, there is no way to ameliorate the horrible, horrifying direction that education, that progress, so-called progress, is taking us. And we must circle back to Protagoras, the Platonic dialogue Protagoras, in which Socrates is talking to Protagoras. And he said something to the effect of, "Oh, wise and learned Protagoras, back to Colombo. Just one thing about education. Yeah, you say that every day you spend with Protagoras, you'll become a better man." "Yes, that's right, Socrates." Yeah. Just one thing. In relation to what? And in what direction and to what end? America, certainly, and the West as well, are afraid of a free and honest debate about the ends of education. And until we have that, we're going to be continuing to marinate in the omnicide of contemporary notions of progress.
You know, you mentioned that quote from Nietzsche about the educators have to be liberators,
Yes.
and how your true self lies not within you, but immeasurably high above you. I think he's getting that from Plato. You said bringing it full circle back to Plato.
Mm-hmm.
So Plato said, you can't teach anybody anything because the soul's filled with eternal knowledge. You can only help the soul remember that which it forgot when it was born. And in between reincarnations, some souls can go out to the horizon of the cosmos and perceive these absolute ideas, these archetypal forms that project the material world into existence. I think, I know for a fact that's what Plato said is the goal of education, to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, which is the eternal source of everything, including consciousness. And I believe Nietzsche was a disguised Platonist. He wore the mask of the opposite. But if you read between the lines, he's advising the same exact thing. You can't educate anybody. You need to liberate people and help them see their highest, immeasurably higher, higher true nature. I know in The Birth of Tragedy, he talks about this outermost sphere where true art resides. So just when you brought Nietzsche back to Plato, I thought that was an opportune time to make that connection.
And in our previous podcast together, Brother Tod, we dipped into Kant's 1784, What is Enlightenment? And I would like to pull out another quote, a different one than the one we used last time. Why don't we have a free and honest discussion about the ends of education? Why do we allow progress to lead us to omnicide? Well, Kant said, quote, it is because of laziness and cowardice that it is so easy for others to usurp the role of guardian. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book which provides meaning for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a doctor who will judge my diet for me, and so on, then I do not need to exert myself. He's also speaking to the division of labor, some of the social formations of modernity. And Nietzsche had a similar insight and a similar critique, coming again back to Schopenhauer as educator, that it's laziness and cowardice. Okay, people are stupid because the education system sucks and they are willing to let mainstream media wash over them. But especially with these, we have almost a universal amount of information at our fingertips, but people don't want to use it. So that is laziness. That is cowardice. That is not necessarily stupidity. And John Kenneth Galbraith, Harvard professor, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, has a pithy little chestnut where he said, people of privilege will always risk their complete destruction rather than surrender any material part of their advantage. Link at Substack. That's from The Age of Uncertainty, 1977. So I've been saying the West. I've been saying G7. Let's spend a little time on what that is. Because G7 includes Japan, but West is not a geographical term. It's a concept. It's a social construction. For me, and I have links at Substack, it includes the G7, the European Union, what's called the Schengen visa area, which is in Europe. The Schengen visa area and the EU are a Venn diagram. Most are in both. Some are in one and not the other. NATO, the Five Eyes Signal Intelligence Consortium, which are the Anglo-American settler colonial nations. America, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. They cooperate on signal intelligence. They are part of the West. And then let's throw in not only Japan, but South Korea. Japan and South Korea are huge garrison states with tens of thousands of American troops. And oddly enough, South Korea just joined NATO's Cyber Command. So that's, in my mind, what I mean when I say the West. We spoke about corporations before. I did. I believe it might have been a judge in the 17th century who said part of the problem of corporations is they have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be damned. But because we've been so indoctrinated our whole lives by media, schools, university, government, and this socially constructed conventional wisdom, to believe that capitalism is natural because it reflects human nature, that we are led to believe any attempt to alter what some call representative democracy, what I call transnational corporate kleptocracy, is ideological, which is meant to be pejorative. Translated, immature, deluded, impractical. But I would submit to you, Dr. Desmond, that the contemporary crisis of progress provides us with a choice that is exactly the same as that identified by the great German socialists Karl Kautsky and one even more near and dear to my heart, Rosa Luxemburg. Socialism or barbarism? But since we are told that any attempt to alter capitalism is impractical, and I've heard this from a lot of politicians. I've been around a lot of them. I've done 10 sessions at the Hawaii State Legislature. Quote, "We can't make the enemy the perfect of the good." Who said socialism was meant to be perfect? One of my main men, my favorite public intellectuals, Vijay Prashad, he said socialism relies on experimentation, and experimentation is part of what makes us human. So now we have the idea that the linear accumulation of knowledge to perfectibility is not true. And some thinkers like Engels, he said, history often moves in leaps and bounds in a zigzag line. We foreshadowed Thomas Kuhn, and you mentioned Maxwell, whose work with magnetism and light started to dissolve the Newtonian physics in favor of the quantum world and the theory of relativity and the new paradigm. So Thomas Kuhn had a monumentally influential book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he said it's not a linear line of progress. It's you have one paradigm, it has a few anomalies, but it explains a lot. People start investigating the anomalies, and then finally they come up with an entirely new system that explains away the anomalies or has less of them. So it's a series of paradigms. It's not linear progression. It's a series of paradigms. Or Samuel Beckett, one of the high priests of classical high modernity, his injunction was to try again, fail better. And I would encourage anyone to go to Substack to find a definition of Anthropocene, but it's essentially that period of human history when man's impact on the planet and the biosphere went fucking bananas. And that could be dated as the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. But if you look at the iconic charts of what are called the Great Acceleration, it kind of begins around 1950. And let me try and pull that up. These charts will be small and difficult to see, but I encourage people to look at them. I'm not sure I got it. I have the wrong part. Down to the chart. Here's the chart. You see it, Dr. Desmond?
I can, but I'm looking at the PDF version.
Well, I think I have it up for our wonderful viewers to see, but if not, I'll just read what the chart says.
I can see it. Yeah, it's up there too. It's just a little small.
Yeah, it's quite small, so I'll read it. But you notice these lines. We recognize these lines. These are algorithmic levels of increase, which we are familiar with from the pandemic, because the infection rates were not arithmetic. They were not mathematical rates of progression. They were algorithmic rates of progression, which is this sudden and extreme upward tilt of these graphs into the fucking stratosphere. And all right around 1950, world population, real GDP, foreign direct investment, that happened a little later. Urban population, 1950. Primary energy use, fertilizer consumption, large dam construction, water use, paper production, transportation, communication happened more around the early 90s with the interwebs, international tourism. So those are just some of the iconic aspects of how humans impacted the biosphere since 1950. And it's why we're catastrophically fucked, in my way of thinking. And as we waltz towards let me say a quick word about peak Anthropocene. Peak oil comes from a petroleum geologist, Hubbard. Peak Everything is a great book by Richard Heinberg, which means we're out of everything, not just oil. So I put those together. Anthropocene is that period when everything goes around 1950. And peak is from peak oil and peak everything. So peak Anthropocene is the peak moment of the human's impact on the biosphere. We're here. And there was another great documentary called Affluenza, link at Substack. And that is I had a phrase, but this is a cognate word combining affluence and influenza, so that affluence can be characterized as a kind of disease. While it may provide the appearance of a lifestyle of plenty in the West, it's suffused with an existential malaise. And we had other great critics of modernism that were not in the article, like Kierkegaard leaps to mind, the early proto-existentialists.
Kierkegaard leaps to mind. A leap of faith.
Synchronicity is real. Yeah. This existential malaise he identified it in the late 19th century. It's never left. And now there's nothing else. The affluenza based on a bubble economy of the Earth's rape is all over, because there is nothing else left to rape. Yet the malaise, which obviates any possibility of continued progress, and the malaise has yet to lift. Since you studied with Tarnas, would you do us and our dozen faithful listeners the courtesy of reading the quote from Cosmo and Psyche?
Yeah, sure. Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche. This is his book on astrology, which he wrote after The Passion of the Western Mind, which he wrote to prove himself as a scholar of history and the history of philosophy. So he's a great scholar. Here's what he says. The underlying anxiety and disorientation that pervade modern societies in the face of a meaningless cosmos create both a collective psychic numbness and a desperate spiritual hunger, leading to an addictive, insatiable craving for ever more material goods to fill the inner emptiness and producing a manic techno-consumerism that cannibalizes the planet. So Al Gore said the same thing in Earth and the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit back in 1992. And like Al Gore said, the solution is to see God everywhere, like a hologram. All of the image of a hologram is located in each point of the holographic film. And similarly, God is located everywhere, says Al Gore. I know that Richard Tarnas is on the same wavelength as that.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we are fucked.
I think we're going to be okay, boys. The spiritual knowledge is there. That, what you think of? Well, the progress of knowledge of the sciences has been real. And I think, and that is what Plato set up at the dawn of Western civilization, academia. And I think that his plan succeeded despite itself. And I say that because Leonard Susskind, I think, is the acme of physics at this point, him and Gerard 't Hooft, his Nobel Prize-winning partner. But they've brought us full circle back to Plato and this knowledge of the ensouled cosmos that I know Richard Tarnas and Al Gore think is the solution to the environmental crisis. Once you see all of the living entities with whom we share the biosphere as eternal souls, one with the omnicentric soul, then that triggers in your mind an abhorrence for just devouring them, whether through eating meat, but as you know, especially just through consumerism. Well, let's just turn this ecosystem into a plastic manufacturing plant so we can create a bunch of asinine consumer goods to fill this gaping hole where God and the realization of the universal soul used to be. Well, I think the mathematical discoveries of our role in the cosmos, if you compare them to what Plato said, the Vedanta philosophers say, and even what Carl Jung says, it's enough to educate people to see, look, you don't live in a meaningless machine-like universe in which consciousness is just some accidental byproduct. You're an eternal soul interwoven with every other being, including the rocks. Not only the young rocks that are just 1 billion years old, but the 4 billion-year-old rocks, and you're one with everything. That's what a gravitational singularity is. It contains every single thing. I think that we're at such a precarious point that we're now being compensated. It takes a miracle, and I think that miracle is emerging. And that to overcome that laziness and complacency that Kant and Nietzsche talked about, that's incumbent upon the educators. You know, that's incumbent upon the philosophical class, the Brahmin caste, not the Brahmin caste that's inherited through blood right, but the spiritually enlightened ones.
The aristocracy of the spirit and intellect, as Nietzsche put it.
Yeah, it's that class of humanity's duty to harvest the fruit, especially from mathematical science, see how it's fulfilled the plan set out for us by the original academic Plato, and reveal that to the world and push that and open the eye of the soul, first of your own eye of the soul and then everybody else. And so I don't think we're totally fucked. Without that divine intervention, I believe we would be. But if there is no omnicentric soul permeating everything, then really what's the difference? If it's a random hiccup, the human species and reason in an uncaring machine-like world, then in the greater picture, who really cares? This planet was bound to die off anyway. When you compare the finite billions of years of this planet to the infinite expanse of time, it renders it meaningless anyway. And when you see the human beings like that, then where's the motivation to work so hard to try to change the trends of history? It's like, who cares? It's all just a kind of squawking atoms in a void anyway. That picture of the human being, that's what's killing us. It's to fill the gap where the soul used to be because of that mechanistic worldview that we're destroying the environment. So I think that the progress of science, especially, is going to give us at least the opportunity to save ourselves. So I don't think we will be fucked. I don't think we're going to go over the cliff. We will without some major spiritual revolution led by heroes of the intellect, which isn't going to be easy, but I believe it's happened in the past, and I believe it can happen. With you, me, and the dozen people watching this, all 14 of us, we can make it happen. I believe.
Yeah, and you mentioned your fourth branch of government as another possible political future. And
Yeah, force people to think philosophically.
and I have a vision of a political future. I think, imagine a car that sees a car crash up ahead, but it's going 80 and it slams on the brakes, but it's too close to the crash and it can't avoid it. So it joins the pile up. I think that's going to happen. I think we're at a point where we can't stop the momentum we already have. But after that, when the dust settles, we will of necessity have to make something to succeed the nation state. And the new model of political organization that I foresee are anarchist bioregions. Not anarchism in the popular conception of murder and mayhem and disorder. That was never anarchy at all. I am an anarchist, and I will say that anarchy is about mutual aid and the smallest level of political organization, which is why the watershed seems reasonable to me, because they can be as big as the Mississippi and Missouri and Columbia, or they can be small watersheds, which I think they'll be more likely so, that could be as big as in the United States, maybe the county level. And anarchist in the sense of more direct democracy akin to ancient Athens. And based on the geographical unit of the watershed, and there are already ancient models, especially those that sustained 1 million people in Hawaii before Captain Cook arrived. The Ahupua'a, a roughly pie-shaped area between the sea and the mountains that was typically, not always, but kind of closely identified with a watershed area. Something like that model. An anarchist bioregion after the crash, when we will not have all of the creature comfort goodies that we enjoy now, because we won't be able to produce them and sustain them, but some type of high-tech backbone most definitely surviving. But because all of those charts we looked at, the population, and well, the population in particular, it went up like that at the Industrial Revolution. The population of the Earth went from the roughly Neolithic levels of maybe 500 million to right around the Industrial Revolution, right around when they started using fossil fuels. And now that we are almost out of fossil fuels and everything else, we're going to have a population crash. I'm absolutely convinced of that, 100%. And a die-off back to Neolithic levels from 8 billion now, or maybe we're even at 9 billion, back to 500 billion. Not right away, not falling off a cliff, but a slow series of cascading geopolitical, environmental, and economic shocks. But that's why we have a dialogue, Professor. We have someone more religious than myself who thinks that forces more powerful and gracious than ourselves will help us have a softer landing.
Yeah,
And
I don't discount some kind of a crash, some kind of a horrible cataclysm.
not
But
all at once, though, I think.
yeah,
Series.
that's likely. That's karma.
Yeah.
But I don't think it'll be the death of civilization. And I do believe that our history and our knowledge of the past will continue and be passed on. And like you say, a high-tech backbone will continue. My slogan is high-tech thinking, simple living. Live simply, like you were saying, in some kind of as simple of a society and self-sufficient as possible, but link all of these little villages on the earth together with the internets to maintain the cosmopolitan level of education. You know, these two extremes of simple living, high-tech thinking. That's my vision for the future.
Yes, and I recently returned to Hawaii from a nearly 2 year long road trip as my means of riding out the pandemic. And my car came to the islands with me, and it has Hawaiian plates and registration now, and has been slapped with a few bumper stickers, and one that I really like, that's very close to what you just said,
Yeah.
is live simply that others may simply live. And with that, it has been yet another stirring edition of The Hard Line, according to Stonefruit, with philosophy professor, Krishna devotee, Nietzsche enthusiast, gentleman and a scholar, and my friend,
The psychopathic Tod Desmond.
Your words, not mine. And thank you to our dozens of listeners.